Story 1. Why I Stay Away from Haunted Houses. I still remember how the screen door slammed that October evening. My foster father's voice, however, was even louder as he shouted after me. "Just where the hell do you boys think you're going?" I gestured over my shoulder at my friend Brett's car, idling at the end of the gravel driveway. "I was going to a haunted house with some friends from school," I explained over the rumble of the motor. "Over my dead body," Frank yelled. "Get back up here." I couldn't understand what I'd done to make Frank Liddell so angry. He and my foster Missouri, Pam, were a little rough around the edges, but they weren't the exploiters or religious nutjobs that I'd feared when I was first put into foster care. They'd been nothing but kind to me so far, although the look on my foster father's face suggested that was all about to change. I wasn't scared of Frank Liddell, but I was afraid of what might happen if my new family rejected me. Giving up a haunted house seemed like a small price to pay to avoid the other kind of foster home. I shook my head at Brett. He rolled his eyes and drove off in a cloud of exhaust fumes, taking my hopes of fitting in at my new school with him. From now on, I'd be known as the loser who didn't celebrate Halloween. I dragged my feet on the way back to the porch, but all my irritation disappeared when I saw my foster father up close. He'd fallen, rather than sat, on the rocking chair beside the door. He was watching me with the shell-shocked, pale expression of a man who just narrowly avoided a gruesome accident. "Have you ever been to one of those things before?" he asked. "A haunted house, I mean?" I shook my head. That was part of the reason why I was so eager to go. They have all kinds now. Ones with mechanical monsters. Ones where people in masks can jump out and grab you. At some of them, you gotta sign a waiver, saying they're not responsible for whatever they do to you. Are you really sure you want to go to a place like that? I hadn't thought about it, but I doubted that the local spooky attractions in the small town where the Liddells lived was known for over-the-top horror. In fact, the bright orange flyer I'd found had said that the place was kid-friendly. Frank rambled on. "Course, most places just put out those warnings for show. If they ever really did hurt anybody, they'd be out of business overnight. Provided that they were ever really in business to begin with. I mean, you never really know for sure who those masked figures are, do you? The ones who you've given permission to come out of the dark, touch you, maybe even drag you off someplace. Sure, it might just be an underpaid actor in a plastic costume. But can you really be sure?" I'd heard rumors like that before. Campfire stories about serial killers in costumes who snuck into Halloween attractions to hunt their victims. I'd never paid them much attention, but the look on Frank's face made me reconsider. I'm not just talking about a couple psychopaths here. What I want you to think about is this. Why do haunted houses exist? I shrugged. I didn't know where this bizarre conversation was going, and at this point, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. But Frank wasn't done. "Don't think I can't see the appeal. Of course getting scared is sort of fun, if afterwards you walk back out into the same, ordinary world you left behind. But what if you don't? What if it's the houses that want people to go inside, and not the other way around?" I took a deep breath. So my foster father thought that buildings can have personalities. There were worse kinds of crazy to be, I reminded myself, and looked wistfully down the country road where the fumes of Brett's car still lingered. This was my life now, and I'd have to make the best of it. I muttered an apology and moved toward the door, telling myself that I should count my blessings. But Frank's hand wrapped around my wrist like a claw. Look, I'm willing to bet that nothing would have happened if you boys had gone to the haunted house in town tonight. People visit haunted houses all the time, right? Nothing happens to them. Well, most of them. But if it did, would anyone notice the pattern? Think about it. If a cop or university professor suggested researching haunted house disappearances, they'd be laughed out of a job. So people look away, and it keeps happening. Frank drank a swig of water like a man throwing back a shot, and for the first time I wondered whether the water that he always carried with him was really a substitute for a different sort of bottle. Halloween wasn't always the big flashy holiday that it is today. When I was your age, we had a few hay bales and pumpkins in front of the town hall, some cardboard witches in the windows of the elementary school, and that was about it. If you wanted something fancy, like a rubber mask or a costume party, you had to go to the big city. Frank sighed. I shouldn't have yelled at you. But when I saw your buddy pull up in his car, I thought back to Halloween night when my two best friends and I took that drive and went to our first haunted house. Cassie and Tyler didn't have many friends. I didn't either. That might have been the only thing the three of us had in common, but it was enough. See, Cassie's dad never did anything but drink and cause trouble, and most folks figured that the apple didn't fall from the tree. Tyler, on the other hand, Frank blushed. Well, the only thing people had against him was that the color of his mama's skin was different from his daddy's. The two of them had been dating for years, which is about as serious as it gets in high school, when they adopted me into the little group. I don't know why. Hell, maybe they were just bored. Either way, with Tyler and Cassie, I finally started doing the sort of things I'd always imagined teenagers did. Smoking in the park, walking down railroad tracks, swimming in the river in summer, and having plans for Halloween night. That's the worst part. The part that still stings. The haunted house was my idea. We had it all planned out. Tyler's mom was the editor for some magazine, and a grateful author had sent her some expensive liquor as a thank you gift. Tyler would steal the bottle and give it to Cassie, who would leave it out for her dad after school. By 6 p.m. he'd be blackout drunk, and Cassie would snatch his keys and pick us up on the way out of town. We'd go to the city, where we'd trick or treat like little kids, visit a haunted house, try to sneak into some college parties. With the full moon rising and that fall wind in our hair, it felt like anything could happen. We had it all planned out. Frank repeated and shook his head. After buying some silly discount masks and gorging ourselves on candy bars from the rich neighborhoods, we headed for the haunted house. We hadn't kept track of time, and Cassie was afraid we wouldn't get there before close, not to mention the line. None of us were used to the city, and just finding a place to park among all those cars was a nightmare. It felt like the house, with its creepy lighting effects and soundtrack of evil laughter, was teasing us. Cassie left the car in front of a fire hydrant, and we took off down the sidewalk, hoping we weren't too late. The ticket guy was a kid our age in zombie face paint, in an oversized pinstripe purple suit. He told us that the house closed at half an hour before midnight, and we were 3 minutes too late. All he wanted to do was finish cleaning up and go home, but I guess the look on our faces made him change his mind. He sighed, took our money, and pulled back the red velvet rope in front of the front porch stairs. The place had probably been some rich farmer's estate once. Now it was gray, gaunt, and rickety. There was something hungry about the way it loomed over us as we walked inside. The double doors creaked open automatically, a nice touch, I thought, and we stepped into a hallway lit only by creepy blue bulbs. Tyler made a joke about what shows up in blacklight. We all jumped a little and laughed when the doors slammed shut behind us. It must have been a pretty fancy house in its day, but the hallway Cassie and I walked down was bare except for plastic skeletons and fake cobwebs. It had a sad, barren look to it, like whoever had set up the haunted house didn't have the budget to decorate it the way that it deserved. Halloween-themed songs played from a speaker somewhere, and candles flickered in a couple jack-o'-lanterns. But that was about it. The three of us were pretty disappointed. We'd expected movie-quality effects, not cheap junk that we could have bought at the dollar store back in town. We'd almost reached the staircase at the far end of the hallway when a laughing woman with a rope around her neck fell from the ceiling. The rope brought her to a halt just above our heads, and we all screamed. Up close, it was clear that we were just looking at a mannequin dressed up like a witch, but that wasn't what had startled me. See, I would have sworn that what I saw was Cassie, eyeless and bone-thin, like she'd been falling so long she'd starved to death. Tyler gave the mannequin a shove and chuckled as it swung on its rope. Cassie shushed him. It didn't seem right, disturbing the silence like that. The echoes were all distorted, like the hallway was somehow bigger than it looked. I put my foot on the first step of the staircase and everything went black. Suddenly I was falling. Not down these steps, but different ones. Stairs so steep I could feel the wind around me as I tumbled through the dark. When I looked up, Cassie had caught me. There were no twisted stairs here, just the dim lobby of a cheap haunted house. I told the other two that I'd race them to the second floor. We were panting by the time we got to the top, even though it couldn't have taken that long. The theme up there was classic monsters. A mummy that popped out of a broom closet, rubber bats bouncing from the ceiling, a mechanical zombie that sat up from its coffin as we passed by. Nothing scary enough to even make us look twice. Nothing like what had happened to me on those stairs. An arrow painted in fake blood directed us to a door on the left, and Tyler yanked the door open impatiently. We were bored already, eager to be done with this and worried about the car. But what we saw behind that door stopped us in our tracks. It was just an ordinary living room. No decorations, no cheesy themes. Just a gramophone, some armchairs, a ticking wall clock in the shape of a cat with big eyes that swung from side to side. It was a near-perfect replica of how people must have lived almost a century ago, except that it looked brand new. There was even a cigar burning in an ashtray and a half-finished glass of brandy, like whoever was living here would be back any minute. It felt obscene, like we were invading someone's privacy and trespassing somewhere we shouldn't. I was about to suggest that we turn back when the door slammed and locked behind us. I knew we had to cross that eerie room to leave it, but even so, it was hard to take that first step. The tiny pink flowers on the hideous wallpaper seemed to squirm like tiny fingers, and I had an awful feeling that we were being watched from the far corner of the room. Suddenly, the gramophone started playing by itself, but the noise coming out of it wasn't music. It was us, Tyler and Cassie and I, screaming, arguing, shouting in terror about bruises and grabbing hands. We'd never spoken those words in our lives. The three of us looked at each other and all had the same thought. Get out of here as quickly as possible. The gramophone kept getting louder and louder. I thought my ears would bleed before we got to the door on the other side of the room, but once we were through it, the noise stopped completely and all the lights went out. We closed the door behind us and leaned against it, too scared to talk. Tyler started to say something about how maybe it was all part of the act, but the words died in his throat, especially after he looked around at where we were. It was a dim, dirty kitchen. If the room we'd left had been something out of the last century, this one was all 1970s. Dark wood cupboards, pea green walls, puke yellow linoleum. The only thing the two had in common was the inescapable, lingering feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. Like something was leading us into its trap, hunting us. Once, when I was a kid, the basketball I was playing with rolled under a neighbor's porch. I crawled in after it without thinking, and as I was feeling around in the dank, cobwebby dark, something growled behind me. I never found out what it was: a stray dog, a mountain lion, or maybe even just a rabid raccoon. But I never felt that kind of fear again until I stepped into that nasty little kitchen, like I'd gotten myself trapped in a cramped place with something hungry and horrible. There were no windows and only one door. We had no choice but to keep going deeper into the house, if that's what it was. There was something wrong with the air in there. It seemed to be moving, and it wasn't until we approached the dripping faucet that I realized what it was. The air was buzzing with thousands of tiny flies. Cassie clamped a hand over her mouth and leaned over the sink to see what they were coming from. Then she groaned and bolted for the door. Tyler followed her, slipping in a puddle of something rust-colored and sticky that was coming from the fridge, and I followed. Our footsteps had woken the place up somehow. There was a bang from inside the cabinets, then another, so hard that they shook, and I realized that I absolutely could not handle seeing whatever was about to come out of there. We shoved each other through the door just in time, and felt the slam when something crashed into it behind us. More came, hard enough to rattle the door on its hinges, but it held. We were in what looked like a children's nursery. Bright, wide-smiling zoo animals painted on the walls. Small bed topped with plain white sheets. A night light in the shape of a grinning plastic moon. It was dead silent, like the room was waiting for us. Then, all at once, for almost human shapes sat up beneath the covers. We froze, too scared to move. Then something reached out from beneath the bed and tried to pull me under. I yelped in pain, kicked it off, and ran. Once the door was pressed shut behind us, I rolled up the cuff of my jeans and found a burn mark in the shape of a tiny hand with too many fingers. It was still painfully cold to the touch. Cassie started yelling, demanding to be let out, shouting that we'd never agreed to let anyone touch us, but she stopped mid-sentence. It was the same argument that we'd heard on the gramophone when we first walked into this nightmare. The realization shocked us into silence, and we finally began to take in our surroundings. We were in another hallway, but this one didn't have an end. The ugly yellow wallpaper and old-fashioned doors went on forever in both directions. Just looking at it made me want to grab onto the floor. Like at any minute the hallway would tilt and I'd slide down the carpet into the abyss. I was still trying to get my head around it when the doorknob of the room we'd left began to turn. There was rustling on the other side, fingers feeling around the gaps and hinges. Tyler started pulling on one doorknob after another, but they were all locked. At the pace he was moving, we struggled to keep up with him. He started knocking instead, swearing that he could hear movement and voices on the other side of the doors. He yelled and pleaded, begging to be let in. Then, when Cassie and I were too far away to help him, he got his wish. The door in front of Tyler swung open, and I saw the terror on his face for just a split second before he was sucked inside. The door shut and locked itself behind him, but Cassie and I weren't going to let that stop us. I kicked the door until my foot went through it, and then I howled in pain. There was nothing but a wall on the other side. It was like the house had swallowed Tyler up. Even worse, we had no idea where we were. The doors were all identical, and none of us had thought to mark the point that we'd started from. Cassie just shut down, holding her head in her hands and muttering about how this couldn't be happening. I remember thinking that at this rate, it wouldn't be long before both of us went crazy, and maybe that was the point. Then I heard hinges creaking. By the time I spun around, the door was wide open. There was nothing but darkness on the other side. At least that's what I thought at first. Once I got closer, though, I saw the stairs. Narrow, uneven, with a plunge into the blackness on either side, and no guardrail. Have I ever mentioned that I'm scared of heights? I couldn't do it. I told Cassie that I'd starve to death in the endless hallway before I'd make myself climb down there, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. Through a mix of pleading, insults, and holding my hand, she finally got me moving, even though I had to crawl backwards to do it. Those steep, jagged stairs were made of something slick and cold as ice. A black wind blew around us as we crawled downwards. It felt like being on the edge of a mountain peak, even though I knew that was impossible. We were still indoors, weren't we? Or maybe, on the other hand, we hadn't been in that cheap haunted house for a long time. Just maybe, we'd been swallowed by someplace else. Before long, the stairs were so tall and narrow that it was almost like being on a ladder above empty space. I was so tense that I started shaking, and I guess it's no surprise that I slipped. I slid downward, unable to grip the narrow steps and knowing that at any second I might fall into the nothingness on either side. But Cassie caught me. It happened exactly as I'd envisioned it earlier that night, just like the yelling that we'd heard on the gramophone. So what about the mannequin? The one that had looked like Cassie, long dead and falling through empty space. Clinging to the almost vertical steps, I shouted my friend's name, even though I knew that it was already too late. By grabbing me, she'd unbalanced herself and gone over the edge. She probably didn't even have time to scream. Cassie had been so sure that the stairs were our way out, but what if there had been a trap all along? After all, we hadn't opened the door to the darkness. The house had. I climbed back up the stairs as quickly as I dared, and found the hallway above exactly as I'd left it. Well, not exactly. There was an end to it on either side, and there were sounds. Cars driving by outside, the hum of a heating system, and the teenager who'd taken our tickets, yelling about how I wasn't supposed to be back there, and anyway, the haunted house was closed. Of course, I filed a police report. A lot of good that did. When I told them what had happened, they decided my friends and I were junkies on a bad trip. Later, they kicked around the idea that we were in some kind of satanic cult and that I'd killed them myself. In the end, I guess they just decided that the whole thing was too complicated and strange to bother with. Tyler's family moved away without a word to anyone, and Cassie's dad drank himself to death before Christmas. The neighbors said that at night he would scream out her name, like he didn't know she was gone. I stayed where I was and did my best to forget about the whole thing. As you can see, it hasn't worked out. The sun had set while Frank had told me his story, and in the twilight gloom he looked almost like a ghost himself. I didn't know what to say. I mumbled something about how it was getting cold on the porch and headed for the screen door. "I'm not asking you to believe everything you hear," Frank smiled. "Just promise me that, as long as you live under my roof, you'll stay away from haunted houses." I nodded, and Frank pulled himself up from his rocking chair to follow me inside for supper. That's when I noticed the scar on his ankle, a scar in the shape of a small, six-fingered hand. Story 2. Visiting the horror house turned into something much more horrific than I expected. I liked my friends. There were not too many, but I prefer quality over quantity in most aspects of my life, so I really enjoyed their company. I guess I was not as important to them as I would like, but I still think I was doing fine as a friend. I didn't go out much in school because I was kind of a geek, dividing my attention equally between studying and playing games. However, getting older, I started to need human interaction as much as good grades, and luckily when I got in university, I managed to win some friends, despite being generally disliked by people. We get together every now and then, and even though I was a bit shy at first, I started to like it a lot, more than how I spent my days before. My parents were over the moon because I haven't seen much daylight, apart from the route between school and home, and school was close. Everything was great, until one going out with friends turned into my worst nightmare. It was a regular night out in the beginning of the summer, and one of my friends, Marvin, said that there is a new place, which aspires to be the most terrifying horror house ever. Why not try it? Everybody was enthusiastic and feeling very brave. We followed Marvin, and in no time we stopped in front of something that looked like a gas station. Weirdly enough, the windows were slightly tinted, so I couldn't quite make out what was happening inside. Vinny said, "Are you sure we're here? It doesn't look like a horror house to me." "Well, yeah, this is a coffee shop and pretty good at that. We should definitely grab a cup of coffee before we move on to the main event. I know this place seems a bit weird, but don't worry. There is the best horror house just behind it, I promise," Marvin answered. We entered, and the lamps were so bright that it made it feel like day, even though it was 10 p.m. The atmosphere was very lively. The waitresses were very hot, and everyone instantly liked it. I, however, started feeling a mixture of anxiety and fear. It was strange. I had no reason to feel what I felt. I was even excited and having kind of fun in my mind since I was doing stuff with my friends in what appears to be an okay place. But my body did not listen to me and made me quiver in fear. It was very disconcerting, but I had to ignore it since I wanted to hang out with my friends. We sat at a table for 6 and the other guys had a lot of fun, while I was hiding my predicament and trying to calm down. Marvin went to the bathroom, and when he came back he said that we are ready to go. I guess the horror house was not meant for everyone since the door leading to it was down what seemed to be an unpopular corridor and quite inconspicuously placed. Luckily, though, Marvin was apparently not everyone, since he knew where he was going, and the guy at the door, who was very tall and almost as wide, greeted him warmly. "Hello, Marvin. You haven't been here lately. What have you been up to?" "Nothing much. I had to study for those annoying exams. But now that they are over, I came to have a little fun. I see that you brought some friends too. Are you sure they can handle it, though? It is a bit scary inside." "Don't worry, they are a tough bunch. I vouch for them." He led us in a room which was the exact opposite of the previous one. The lights barely made anything visible, and the place felt very uninviting. This time my bad mood was mirrored by the others. Apart from one of the girls leaving, saying that she feels unwell, everyone was still eager to see how scary this horror house would be. Abruptly, I felt a familiar tightening in my belly and had to immediately ask where the bathroom is. "Ah, it is just there. Right through this door. You'll see it." He showed me. The guy was oddly nice for his appearance. "Wait for me, guys. I'll be back in no time," I said. I sat and got ready for action. I really had some job to do. When I finished and came back, there was nobody in the room, and it was almost completely dark. I tried to get out, but both doors were locked. Real fear started to creep in, and I started nervously alternating between the two doors, maybe hoping that one of them might magically unlock. But to no avail. In a moment of going from one door to the other, I heard the faint noise of a revving chainsaw coming from upstairs. It got stronger and stronger, and when the noise got at its loudest, I began hearing screaming, shouting, and swearing, and then gunshots, and then again screaming, but this time more desperate. The voices I heard were familiar, these of my friends. It suddenly got very quiet, and I froze in place in full panic mode. I dreaded to think what happened to them and could only expect my turn to come. And it came with the sound of the chainsaw. Someone was cutting down the door with it, and when he finished, my legs stopped working and I could just lie in a fetal position hoping for a quick death. On the faint light coming from the corridor, I saw that he had a very unusual complexion. His skin looked like that of a Zergling from Brood War and was wearing a working mask and apron. He was slowly coming towards me with a manic laughter and a calm step. When he got close enough, he swung at me, and the big guy who greeted us woke me up. It turns out, I have slept through the spectacle and my friends are long gone. He was checking the bathroom because the place was closing up for the day. He kindly showed me the way out and said that he hopes I will come back and get to see the horror house someday. Everyone forgot about me, including the kind staff member. I really thought I had friends, but I guess nobody cares about me. This was confirmed tomorrow in college, where my friends still did not remember that I exist and did not bother to ask what happened. I didn't even get to know what happened in the horror house. Must have been fun. I decided I don't want friends since I don't deserve them anyway, given how awkward I am. I have been suffering from depression since a few weeks after this event. This happened 2 years ago, and my life is still hell. It's even getting worse by the day. So bad that I lately started to prefer the alternative scenario. Story 3. House of Horrors. I live in a small town in India. An attraction in my town used to be the House of Horrors, which opened a few months back in the mall. People would flock together to go there. We all like to get scared, don't we? Business was booming. The place was owned by my friend Rajesh's father. I have been there a couple of times myself with my friend, Rajesh and Nawaz. It was scary and fun the first time, but the second time the thrill was gone. It was all fun and scary until one day when it was suddenly closed. As I write this, it is being replaced by an under-construction KFC. It was a Sunday. The House of Horrors used to be active from 10 a.m. in the morning till 10 p.m. at night. I was sitting with my friends at the McDonald's, which gives a great view of the people running out of the House of Horrors, eating my favorite chicken burger when I saw a peculiar sight. A man and a woman came out through the exit of the House of Horrors very calmly. They were both in black suits and were mostly emotionless except for a faint smirk on their lips as they slowly walked away. I thought they might be people from the management or something, as no one gets out of that place with such a calm demeanor. 5 minutes later, when the entrance door didn't open for the next group of people, the security guard went in to investigate and found all the people inside were dead except for one man, who was immediately transferred to the hospital. The cause of death was heart failure. They died because they were scared shitless by something, and their heart just gave in. The one who survived apparently fell down and injured his head and hence doesn't remember anything. Most probably he survived because he lost consciousness. The police started an investigation to find the suspects, those two people in black suits. But it was fruitless as they were never found. The security cameras show that they entered through the mall entrance and then went straight to the ticket counter to get the tickets to the House of Horrors, and then the cameras show them going to the basement parking lot. But then there is no sign of them leaving in the car or otherwise. It is as if they disappeared into thin air. I only know all these because Rajesh's father owned the House of Horrors, and the police officer in charge of this investigation was Nawaz's father. Everything was hushed and wrapped up quickly. After that incident, no horror movies have been released in the theaters near us or in the multiplex within the mall. I think this is because no one wants another massacre like it happened in the House of Horrors. This theory of mine was confirmed when Nawaz showed us a few pictures of the crime scene. He was able to snap a few pictures from his father's folder containing the pictures of the crime scene. One picture was particularly scary. It shows on a side of the wall a message written with blood. The message was a simple single-line statement. "We hope this is scary enough for all of you." Story 4. The Scary House. Growing up as a kid, everyone hears those crazy stories and legends about the unnatural. And most kids are quick to believe those stories. I was 12 years old, and I lived in a decent-sized suburban neighborhood. It was covered with trees, especially huge maple and pine trees that towered over the houses. The neighborhood seemed big for a kid, but wasn't actually all that big. I had about 4 other friends that lived there too. We would hang out sometimes and ride our bikes around the neighborhood. About a block from the house was an old, decaying, red, wooden house with a brownish-bluish roof. The yard was overgrown, and the number of trees in it covered it like a blanket. We called it the Scary House. I was legitimately scared of that place. There were all sorts of stories about it. Apparently, there was a biker in the neighborhood who went missing one night, and they found his bicycle on top of the roof of the house. A team of construction workers tried to destroy the house, but were chased out by some sort of winged monster. My favorite one was about 13 different ghosts that haunted it. Each one had a different ability. One could always hear you, and another could always see you. I only really ever half believed this stuff, and I only got more doubtful as I got older. Two of my friends that lived in my neighborhood were older than the rest of us. One of them was sort of a jerk. His name was Alan, and he was always doing stupid things. But he wasn't annoying enough to where we hated him. We were nearing the end of October, and Halloween decorations had filled the streets. I had just gotten out of school and was riding my bike home with David, my other friend, and Alan. "Hey dude, you know what would be sick?" Alan shouted out to us. "What?" I replied, only paying half attention. "This Halloween, we should actually go inside of the scary house. Do you know how stupid that would be? If we got caught, we would get in so much trouble. They could get the police involved. That shit's illegal, even if it is abandoned," David said to him with a stern voice. "Don't be scared, guys. I can get us all in without anybody finding out," Alan called out back. This idea did sound a little stupid to me, but I did think it could be fun. I had always wondered what the inside looked like. We never got to see it, as most of the windows were boarded up. "I'll ask Jim if he wants to go," I said to Alan. "John, don't be such an idiot, dude." David yelled at me. "It'll be fine, bro. Nothing bad will happen." "Dude, it will be fun," I responded. David looked down. "Fine, I'll think about it," he finally said. Days went by and decorations filled up the streets. Everything from jack-o'-lanterns to pop-up ghosts, skeletons, and monsters. Jim agreed to go to the house, and so did Alan's friend Elliot. But David was slow to decide. We would bother him every day at school to go with us. The day before Halloween, a Friday, he finally agreed to go with us. I think he just caved into peer pressure. His only condition was that we stayed there for an hour, and no more. Halloween has finally come. TV channels were playing horror movie marathons, and I had been sitting on the couch all day, eating candy. "So what are you gonna do tonight, John?" My mom asked me when she got home from work. "I'm going out with Jim and David." I didn't tell her about Alan and Elliot, as my parents didn't like them and thought they were a bad influence. "Aren't you too old to trick or treat?" My mom chuckled a little. "Nah, I bought a dinosaur costume that looks like it will scare the crap out of people. Plus, free candy." I proudly told her. "All right, just whatever you do, stay out of trouble. And don't get hurt." "I won't, Mom." The sun began to set around 6 o'clock. By then, we were already getting anxious kids ringing our doorbells, begging for candy. They were all wearing different sorts of costumes, everything from ghosts and clowns to robots. It was my job to hand out the candy to the kids. Around 8:30 I got a hard knock on my door. I came to the door expecting more kids, but instead, I was greeted with David and Jim, who weren't wearing costumes and asking for candy. "Dude, you ready to go?" David asked me. "Yeah, bro. Hey Mom, I'll be back in an hour." I screamed out before leaving my house. David and Jim had their bikes sitting on the sidewalk. I went around to my backyard to get mine and came back with the gray bike. "You sure you want to do this, man?" David asked me one more time. "Just chill, dude. It'll be fine," I said back to him with an annoyed tone. We rode in silence to the house. It was a full moon tonight, and pretty cloudy too. Even though it was getting pretty late, there were still a good amount of trick-or-treaters out. The scary house was only a block away from my house, so it didn't take long to get there. When we arrived, Alan and Elliot were sitting by the gate to the backyard. "Yo, what's up, guys? Y'all ready?" Elliot smiled when we came up. They both had flashlights and Alan had a backpack on. We waited a while for it to be completely clear from other people. Luckily, no police drove by, because a group of teenagers sitting outside an abandoned house on Halloween looked pretty suspicious. We climbed over the gate and jumped into the overgrown backyard. There was a turned-over stone bench and what looked like a car from the 70s parked in the garage. Alan immediately went up to the back door and turned the rusted bronze handle, which caught on the lock. "No shit, it's going to be locked, bro." Elliot made fun of him. Alan ignored him and pulled a crowbar out of his backpack. I suddenly felt uneasy about this whole thing. David and Jim's eyes widened. He brought the crowbar down on the handle again and again till it broke off, and then proceeded to kick the door in. Elliot and Alan turned on their flashlights and stepped in. We followed. There were white sheets covering all the furniture, and everything was covered in dust. I felt chills run down my spine. We came to the kitchen and Alan took off his backpack and pulled a black box out of it. He set the box on the table and pulled out a board and another object. Elliot shined his flashlight on the board, revealing an Ouija board. I felt my heart drop. "Oh no, no!" Jim yelled out. It was the first time he had spoken all night. Jim was a shy kid, but he loved horror movies. He had always thought stuff like this was too far, though, and he, like me, was legitimately scared of it. "What the hell is this?" David scorned Alan with a disappointed look on his face. "Geez, guys, just calm down. You gotta do more than just look around inside this house. There is only one real way to find out if this is haunted," he replied with a sly smile. Alan and Elliot sat down. I hesitated for a few seconds, then followed them. My parents had always told me to stay away from this game, but now I was curious. David looked at me with disapproval. Jim's eyes darted between the three of us and David. He finally decided to sit down at the table. "Well, are you with us or not?" Alan smiled at David. David sighed loudly and sat down. "Good," Alan reacted with satisfaction. He put the glass cup upside down on the board, and we all put our hands on it. Elliot had a slight smile on his face, as if he wasn't taking it seriously and trying to stifle back laughter. "Is there anyone here that would like to talk to us?" Alan asked aloud. Elliot giggled. We waited and waited, but nothing happened. "If there is anyone here, please tell us now," Alan shouted, a little angrier and more authoritative. The glass began to move, starting at Y, then to E and S. "Stop messing with us. You're doing that." David looked at Alan with a steely expression. "I swear I'm not doing anything." Alan sounded like a little kid on Christmas. "What is your name?" Alan asked even louder. The glass began to move again. It went from J to I to M. Jim's eyes widened, and he looked up with an uneasy demeanor. The table began to shake. The two flashlights popped and darkness covered the table. "What the fuck just happened?" David shouted into the darkness. My eyes began to slowly adjust. Everyone was sitting down, everyone but Jim. He was standing still, looking straight ahead. Jim? Are you all right?" I asked nervously. Jim turned around and walked to the fireplace in the other room. Elliot and Alan were completely silent. David had stood up and was watching Jim, who had bent down and picked something up. I couldn't make out what it was. David began to walk towards him. Jim, man, what are you doing? There isn't actually a ghost in here, David tried to reassure him. Jim stepped towards David. I could see that he was holding a rusted fire poker now. Alan and Elliot had stood up too. Jim suddenly thrust the fire poker right through David's chest. The bloody tip popped out of his back. Alan screamed and sprinted towards the broken-down back door, followed closely by Elliot. "You're right. There are no ghosts in here," Jim said to David in a calm voice, before pulling out the poker and letting the dead body drop to the floor. I shot up and followed Elliot and Alan to the door, knocking over the table in my frenzy. As I ran out of the house, I heard Jim laughing behind me. Alan and Elliot were already waiting for me on their bikes. "Come, let's go," they shouted as I jumped on mine. We quickly took off, leaving the house behind us. "Hey, I know y'all. Y'all are those boys from Grace's class. She says y'all are a little weird," the man told us. I almost smiled at the little joke, although I couldn't tell whether he was joking or being serious. He went over to the staircase and called Grace's name. A few moments later, a black-haired girl came walking down the stairs. She smiled when she saw us. "Hey, guys. What are you doing at my house at 12 at night?" Her smile transformed into a frown. This is going to sound crazy, but Elliot, Jim, and David, they're dead. I stared at her with unblinking eyes. "Sure they are," she laughed a little. I continued to stare at her with the same expression. Her face darkened. "You're not joking, are you?" "Damn it, I can't find the home phone." I heard the father cuss from the kitchen. "I'll go get my cell phone," Grace remarked and slowly walked up the stairs. While the father continued to look, Alan and I sat on the couch in silence. Minutes passed, yet Grace did not come back down. "She never takes this long to find her cell phone." The father's voice trailed off as he walked over to the bottom of the staircase. "Grace, you're taking forever up there," the father shouted. There was no response. A sudden ringing erupted below me. It was coming from under the couch cushion. I jumped off the couch and threw away the cousin, revealing the white phone. The father came over and picked it up, pressing the green answer button as he brought it to his ear. "Hello?" "Hello, Robert. Have you seen your daughter Grace recently?" A low voice responded on the other end. "You son of a bitch," Robert cussed and began to walk over to the stairs. Nah, she isn't in her room anymore." The backyard lights came on, revealing a girl strapped to a chair in the middle of the yard. I saw Robert's face convey a mix of emotions, mostly anger. He began to rush violently towards the back door. "Take one more step, and I'll put a bullet in the side of her head." The voice screamed angrily. Robert obeyed and stood still, biting his lips. Good. You see, I saw something like this in a movie once. Well, Jim did. You see, he was a big fan of horror movies. I liked that. It gave me all sorts of ideas and tricks to pull. This might seem a little cliché, but I like it. I have a few questions, a trivia. You answer the questions right, and maybe I'll let her go, maybe not. "Hand the phone over to Alan, please," Jim said with a nasty tone. "I'll kill you," Robert whimpered before reluctantly handing over the phone to Alan, who slowly put it up to his ear. Alan, how do you feel knowing you caused all this? Knowing this all rests on your conciseness. Shut up, Alan screamed suddenly. Speak when I tell you to unless you want this bitch to die. Now, Alan, you are a douchebag, plain and simple. Do you know why you are? Because you know you have a pitiful and meaningless life. You think no one will like you unless you are funny and try to fit in. That's why you make fun of people. Because you know it makes you feel better about yourself. Yes, you hate yourself. And now you hate yourself even more. Am I right or am I right? Jim's voice sounded happy at the end there. That's not true. Alan spoke rapidly and harshly. I jumped as a shot rang out. Grace mumbled a scream through the rag covering her mouth. I saw blood run down her right leg. Robert turned around and ran into his room. Wrong answer. Next, it will be her other leg than her head. Jim hissed into the phone. Now, what was that answer again? Yes, it's true. Good. Robert came out of his room holding a revolver. He threw open the door and stepped outside, holding the revolver up at the ready. I was expecting Jim to shoot him and or Grace any second, but he didn't, at least at first. Robert walked slowly and cautiously around the backyard. When he was walking towards the corner of the fence post, another shot rang out. Robert fell to the floor without making a word. Grace mumbled a scream again. Alan quickly ran out to her and began untying the ropes that ensnared her arms and legs. Another gunshot went off and I saw blood explode out of Grace's head. It covered Alan from his stomach up. I heard a door creak open and noticed the shed in the corner of the yard open. I was too overcome by adrenaline to feel any grief for the two deaths I just witnessed for now. Alan, get back in here. I screamed, but he wasn't moving. I heard Jim, or whatever it really was, laughing from the shed. A chainsaw? Nah, too cliché. Oh, this will do. I heard him speak loudly and cheerfully. Robert groaned as he began to move again. He slowly began to pick himself back up. I saw Jim come out of the shed. He wasn't carrying a gun or an ash poker, but instead had a blue circular saw in his right hand. I also noticed the 3 bullet holes in the chest and stomach. He headed straight at Robert at a fast walking pace. Robert tried to reach for the revolver, but it was too late. Jim flicked the saw on and brought it down on Robert. I heard him scream and looked away quickly. I didn't know if I could see any more blood or death that night. I felt like there was nothing I could do to stop this demon or whatever was doing this. I felt like lying down and just accepting my fate. It wasn't like I had a family to go back to anyway. But as Robert's screams and the sound of the saw stopped, something inside me snapped. I had to take action. I needed to teach this motherfucker a lesson. Jim looked over at Alan and dropped the saw. Alan, you're making this too easy, you know that? Where's the fun if your victims don't even fight back? I saw a smile across his face as he began to walk over. You were Jim's least favorite, so I'm going to take my time. For his sake. Alan dropped the rope he was holding in his hands and turned around to face Jim. I could see the fear in empty eyes. Jim wasn't looking in my direction, so I took this moment to do a sort of crouch jog thing over Robert's bloody mess of a body, where he had left he saw just sitting there. I can't believe he actually just left this, I thought as I picked it up. I winced as my hands made a splotching sound as they came into contact with the blood on the handle. I heard a whack and turned around to see Alan on the floor and Jim standing over him. "I'm going to break every single one of your bones slowly, starting with your legs." I crouched and snuck over as I saw and heard repeated kick after kick to Alan's body. When I got within a few feet behind Jim, I sprung up, ready to turn on the saw and bring it down on his neck. Jim whipped around and grabbed my arms, holding the saw back. Whatever this was had a lot more strength than Jim ever did in real life. "You really think I didn't see you trying to be all stealthy and sneak around? You see, I just wanted you to feel like you had a little bit of hope, just so I could snatch it away from you." He mocked me as he squeezed my arms. I felt like my bones were going to crack any second. Jim was just staring at me with wide eyes and an unnatural smile. I gritted my teeth and let out a little whimper as I felt my left arm erupt in sharp, fiery pain. "What are you?" I asked through gritted teeth. "You humans have such a limited concept of the evil that exists in this universe. I'm not a demon or a ghost, but I do enjoy making you suffer." His face began to stretch and widen as his eyes fell back into his head. His mouth opened so wide that his jaw began to come apart. Within his eyes, I saw stars and galaxies. A black goo with more stars on it began to pour out of his mouth. His legs began to disjoint, and he hunched over. I felt dread like I never had before. The old gods have willed this so. "Sunka taha lo lo na." He began to speak in an unknown language, and the house began to shake. I noticed the walls stretch away and the doors all shrink. Suddenly Alan jumped up and latched onto Jim's back like a monkey, covering his now crooked face with his hands. "Let go of me." Jim let go of my arms and spun around with such tremendous force that he knocked Alan completely off his back and onto the ground again. I didn't hesitate and turned on the saw quickly, almost missing the switch in my haste. I brought it down with no restraint on Jim's neck. Blood began to shoot out like a geyser. Jim let out an inhumane scream. I kept pushing and pushing, getting soaked with the blood as I had jumped into a pool of it. The momentum almost made me trip when the blade had nothing left to cut through, and I was still pushing hard. I turned off the saw and dropped it, breathing heavily. I was completely crimson above my waist, and on the ground below was Jim's head, separated from the rest of his body, and it had returned back to normal, along with the house. I wasted no time, almost immediately turning around and heading back to the shed. I came back out when I was holding one of what I was looking for, garbage bags. I also had a gallon of gasoline in my other hand. Alan had stood back and was watching me without any noise. I ignored him back as I put Jim's bloody body and head into the black bag. Without saying a word, I opened the side gate and began to walk down the street, leaving Alan alone in the yard behind, with a single goal in my mind. I stood alone in the dark for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was just minutes. Everything that happened tonight felt surreal. I felt like I would make up any second and come down to greet my happy parents with a good morning. But that would never be the same again. All of this was my fault. I felt empty inside. All my life, I just wanted others to like me. I just wanted to fit in, be popular. You could say I was an asshole, a douchebag, but I didn't know it would cause the deaths of others. Hell, I didn't even think about it much at all. I looked down at my body. I was soaked in blood, but not as bad as John was. One of my legs felt like it was on fire, but I could still walk. I limped my way back to the empty house. David, Jim, Elliot, all my friends are gone now. And John. Well, John looks like he's gone crazy. I know he will never be the same again. The phone was still lying on the floor by the door, just where I had dropped it. I picked it up and slowly dialed 911. I told them everything except for the part about Jim being possessed by whatever creature that was. It ended with the operator telling me they would be over there as quickly as they could. I hung up and dropped the phone on the floor again, not being in the mood to stay on the line. I knew nothing bad would happen now. I decided to head out to the front yard to get some fresh air and wait for the police. I sat on the single brick step in front of the door and buried my arms into my head. All the other lights in the other houses were off, which meant they probably just slept through the whole thing. I waited forever, with no company other than my grief and misery, but eventually heard sirens blaring off in the distance. It sounded like they were getting closer too. I also noticed something else too. A rainbow was emerging from our neighborhood into the night sky. But instead of curving, this one just went straight up into the stars. And I noticed it was coming exactly from the location of the scary house.